In that faraway summer of 1795, on a small island on Nova Scotia's southern shores, three young men set in motion what has become one of the world's most enduring and perplexing mysteries. What began as an innocent discovery, fueled by romantic notions of buried treasure, soon became the proverbial Pandora's box. For over 2 centuries, searchers and treasure hunters have tried to unlock the secrets of Oak Island. 6 lives have been lost along with the millions of dollars ventured, and also lost, in the enterprise. Yet today many people remain bewitched by the island's spell as the search continues. Welcome. In the vast waters of Nova Scotia, Canada, lies a small, mysterious island called Oak Island. For over 2 centuries, this enigmatic piece of land has captured the imagination of treasure hunters and researchers alike, thanks to the legend of the Oak Island Money Pit. This story delves into the history, facts, and captivating tales surrounding this unfathomable mystery. Legend has it that in the late 18th century, a young boy named Daniel McGinnis set foot on Oak Island's shore. As he explored the island, he came across a peculiar depression in the ground, marked by a small oak tree with a rope hung around one of its branches. Intrigued, young McGinnis gathered a group of friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and together they started to dig. With each shovel of earth removed, the young treasure hunters uncovered layer upon layer of obstacles, including logs, coconut fibers, and clay platforms, leaving them astounded. As they delved deeper, the true perplexity of the money pit revealed itself, for it seemed to be a bottomless pit, cunningly designed to stall their progress and protect its treasure from prying eyes. News of the boys' discovery spread across Nova Scotia, and numerous individuals and organizations attempted to uncover the secrets of Oak Island. Among them were the famed Truro Company, which employed the renowned engineer Frederick Blair, and the Oak Island Association, which included wealthy financiers such as Franklin D. Roosevelt's grandfather. The quest to unearth the money pit turned into a race against time, as collapses, floods, and unexplainable booby traps thwarted each venture. Over the years, tunnels were dug, drill holes were bored, and divers risked their lives, yet the treasure remained elusive. Many speculated that the pit contained unimaginable wealth, such as the Holy Grail or even Marie Antoinette's missing jewels. As the 20th century unfolded, treasure hunters continued their valiant efforts, including famed individuals like Gilbert Hedden, Robert Dunfield, and even Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. Despite their expertise and investments, the money pit stubbornly resisted exploration, as if determined to keep its secrets buried forever. Amidst the enduring fascination with the Oak Island money pit, skeptics questioned its existence altogether. Some believed it to be an elaborate hoax or natural formation. However, the sheer intensity of the perseverance, dedication, and resources invested in the pursuit of its truth only served to reinforce its allure. Today, the Oak Island mystery still intrigues adventurers and scientists. Some theorize that the pit was engineered by ancient civilizations, such as the Knights Templar or the Vikings, who sought to hide valuable artifacts. Others suggest that it may hold crucial historical documents that could rewrite history. Oak Island remains a place of wonder, its unsolved mystery capturing the attention of generations. While the ravages of time and nature have eroded much evidence, the allure of the money pit persists, inspiring future explorers to take up the torch in the quest for truth. For as long as Oak Island stands, the legend of the money pit will continue to weave its magic, beckoning those consumed by the pursuit of adventure and the longing for hidden treasures. The history and mystery surrounding the Bermuda Triangle are rooted in a series of unexplained disappearances and unusual incidents that have occurred within this geographic area. The Bermuda Triangle, also known as the Devil's Triangle, is a region in the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean. Its boundaries are roughly defined by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The area gained notoriety in the mid-20th century when stories emerged of ships and planes mysteriously disappearing without a trace. One of the most well-known incidents is the disappearance of Flight 19 in 1945. 5 Navy torpedo bombers set off from Florida on a routine training mission and vanished, along with the aircraft sent to search for them. No remains were ever found, leading to speculations of supernatural or extraterrestrial phenomena. Over the years, other incidents added to the mystery. The USS Cyclops, a U.S. Navy collier ship, went missing in 1918 with 309 crew members on board. In 1948, a civilian Douglas DC-3 airplane vanished with 32 people on board. These are just a few examples among the many recorded disappearances. Theories attempting to explain the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle include natural phenomena, human error, and even alien abductions. Some attribute the disappearances to unusual magnetic properties in the region, while others suggest underwater methane gas explosions as a possible cause. Additionally, the Bermuda Triangle does experience strong currents and unpredictable weather patterns, making navigation challenging. However, scientific evidence does not support the idea that the Bermuda Triangle is any more dangerous than other well-traveled areas of the ocean. The number of incidents reported in the region is not significantly higher than in similar areas around the world. Nevertheless, the allure of the Bermuda Triangle continues to captivate the public imagination. It has become a topic of numerous books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. While the truth behind the Bermuda Triangle remains elusive, it remains an enduring and fascinating mystery. (1986) Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine suffered a catastrophic meltdown. An assault of radioactive atoms burst forth from the wreckage and dispersed across Europe, even reaching as far as North America. In the area surrounding the power plant, an ecological disaster began to unfold. Pine trees crumbled, insect populations plummeted, polluted soil withered crops. In the hours following the meltdown, residents of nearby neighborhoods were forced to up and leave with little notice while the liquidators, military personnel and other civilians, moved in to clean up the radioactive mess. Pets were not permitted to travel with the evacuees and had to be abandoned. A directive by the Ukraine Ministry of Internal Affairs tasked military personnel with hunting down and executing the pets, including the many dogs of the region inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but some of the pets evaded capture, making a home in the CEZ. The liquidators would often feed and house the now strays, and the populations persevered. Today, Chernobyl's doomed reactor is entombed within a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus, but the effects of its meltdown linger. The radioactive atoms, radionuclides, released in the 10 days after the catastrophe still permeate the soil, the water and, yes, the animals that have made the CEZ their home, including Chernobyl's dogs. This unfortunate fate for the canines has a somewhat grim silver lining. By studying the DNA of these dogs, researchers could better understand how chronic exposure to radiation leaves long-lasting effects on physiology and health. In a new study, published in the journal Science Advances on March 3, researchers set out to decode the genetics of the canine population around Chernobyl, characterizing the genes of 302 free-roaming dogs that now call the power plant and surrounding region home. It's the first time a large mammal in the CEZ has been studied in this way. They offer a chance to see how the harsh environment, which includes exposure to high and low levels of radiation, can affect the DNA of animals who have lived and bred for 15 generations in this region, said Elaine Ostrander, a geneticist at the National Human Genome Research Institute of the National Institutes of Health and author on the study. By studying tiny changes in the DNA known as SNPs, the team were able to measure genetic similarity in these populations. Comparing Chernobyl's dogs to purebred canines from elsewhere in Europe, the team revealed that one group of canines living close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, occupying Pripyat and the nearby train station, is a genetically distinct and closed family. This group differed, genetically, from dogs living just 10 miles away, in Chernobyl City, which appear to have migrated more and bred with local dogs. This sets the stage for future studies aimed at finding mutations in key genes that result from the radioactive environment. Importantly, the study doesn't show that radiation in the disaster zone has, itself, caused changes or mutations in the dog's DNA. Inbreeding in isolation can cause the kind of changes the team has seen in the DNA. To tell if there were de novo radiation-caused mutations, the researchers would have needed to conduct whole genome sequencing of the dogs and see if there were any unique variants in this population, said Claire Wade, an animal geneticist and computational biologist at the University of Sydney not associated with the study. A de novo mutation is one that wasn't passed down genetically. By looking at a whole genome, all of an organism's DNA, rather than just SNPs, researchers can tease out more information, discovering mutations in genes that may have physiological effects. That's exactly what the Chernobyl dog team plans to do. With more than 400 DNA samples now collected, the researchers can begin to interrogate how DNA variation in these Chernobyl populations might help the dogs live in a highly radioactive environment. Perhaps, for instance, there are certain genes that have been switched on or off that confer a survival advantage in dogs closer to the plant. Comparing the whole genome sequences will help uncover these relationships. At present, a full DNA sequence has been retrieved for over half of the 400 samples, noted Tim Musso, a biologist at the University of South Carolina who has long studied the organisms around Chernobyl following the disaster and an author on the paper. A myth has persisted that life has returned and flourished in Chernobyl post-disaster, but that's not necessarily the case. Though the dogs are the first large mammal to be studied in Chernobyl, previous research has explored the effects of radiation on many different organisms within the region, from insects to birds. For instance, a 1997 paper showed that barn swallows exposed to radiation around Chernobyl had higher de novo mutations and were more likely to be partially albino, and Musso's studies have shown the abundance of species has dropped in contaminated areas. Other studies hint at the kind of revelations that might come from studying organisms in the CEZ. In 2020, scientists discovered a species of fungi with high levels of melanin, a pigment that can absorb radiation and turn it into energy. Producing high levels of melanin could provide a kind of protective sunscreen or shield for astronauts, where the threat of radiation is ever present. Will the genomes of Chernobyl's dogs provide a similar level of insight? That's an open question the team is eager to answer. We really have what we need to address questions regarding the role of the environment on survival in this environment. If you like this video and is not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing as it really helps me out a lot. Thanks for watching. The lost city of Atlantis, first mentioned by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato more than 2,300 years ago, is known as one of the oldest and greatest mysteries of the world. According to Plato, the utopian island kingdom existed some 9,000 years before his time and mysteriously disappeared one day. Famed for having been the exhibit of all worldly pleasures in the world, this city is as enigmatic as it is inviting even after years of research. The exact truth about this city has not been found, and that adds even more to all the folklore attached to it. The biggest question that boggles the minds of all scientists is where Atlantis is. The narration suggested that the city is believed to have sunk into the sea after an earthquake or tsunami. According to him, the so-called Atlantis was a large island near the Rock of Gibraltar and consisted of a Poseidon statue, concentric walls and canals. Plato added that the city under the sea should have been somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. However, no technology has revealed any such town on the ocean bed. While some theories suggested that the Atlantis is located in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Spain, few also argued that it could be even under Antarctica. For a long time, the Azores was believed to be the site of the city of Atlantis. However, the new research has revealed a new place, and the scientists are sure that Atlantis can be found in Cadiz, somewhere between the Spain and Morocco waters. The extent of truth in this story is a mystery in itself. Questions like where are Atlantis or whether it even exists for real are still unanswered. But until the truth beneath it can be unraveled entirely, the world will continue speculating about the existence of the greatest city of all times. The fertile and beautiful city of Atlantis, where half god and half human lived, is believed to have been an autonomous region where people grew their food and reared animals. Farmers in the city used to grow crops in the fertile plains on the outskirts with the help of a well-maintained irrigation system. They also built beautiful buildings and other architecture from black and red stone materials. They also had access to rare metals and even alloys like brass made, used crystals extensively for leisure and experimental purposes, and had a lot of free time to play with volcanoes. Other than the legend of the lost city of Atlantis and other fables, the fact about the city remains unknown. Among historians and other researchers, the findings of Edgar Cayce had something different to tell. Edgar Cayce believed in the rising of the lost city once again like the sun rises from the sea. He predicted a new land would appear off the east coast of North America. He also suggested that the souls of many people who lived in Atlantis had been incarnating to America to usher in a new era of enlightened human consciousness. Stories also claim that the original inhabitants of the lost city of Atlantis are believed to be of extraterrestrial origin and reached there about 50,000 years ago from the Lyrian star system. Despite being much taller and fairer than today's average human being, the average lifespan of these people is believed to have been 800 years, making them robust prototypes of the existent human race then. As some claim that the lost city of Atlantis was on Mars or just a colony of an alien civilization, the inhabitants of Atlantis City are believed to possess exceptional powers such as the ability to control the weather and modify volcanic eruptions. Some accounts also mention possessing a device that allowed them to channel energy from time and space. Even though the myth says that the inhabitants of Atlantis City were superior beings, there are some opinions that it is just a fictional representation of a brutal fashion of life. While many still consider the lost city of Atlantis a conspiracy theory, Many studies doing the rounds suggest that the fable is based on actual events. Researchers had previously proposed that Atlantis was located on the Greek island of Santorini, the Italian island of Sardinia or Cyprus. However, recent research has shown that the city may be found between Spain and Morocco waters in Cadiz. The region is quite prone to tsunamis, one of the largest ones that occurred in November 1755 and is documented in historical accounts. According to mythological accounts, the city of Atlantis fell as the people became greedy and immoral, which angered the gods, who sent them a night of fire and earthquakes that led to the city being drowned. According to researchers, the cause of its fall was also a terrible earthquake which swallowed the civilization in no time. Plato's writing is the only proof of the existence of such a city. He mentioned that it existed 9,000 years before his own time, and its stories were passed down by artists, poets and writers. According to legend, the lost city of Atlantis was a utopian civilization and a great naval power. It was made of concentric islands separated by wide moats connected by canals that reached its center. The islands were rich in metals and minerals like gold and silver and supported exotic wildlife. As per legend, Cleito had 5 pairs of twin sons with Poseidon. The eldest was named Atlas. He later inherited his father's kingdom and became the great king of Atlantis. Will we ever find Atlantis? Let me know in the comment section and subscribe for more content if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.
Pablo Escobar and White House don't seem like they belong in the same sentence. Yet there's a photo floating around the internet of the infamous drug kingpin posing in front of the DC landmark with his son, looking like a tourist in his white shirt and blank pants. So what's the story behind the Pablo Escobar White House photo? Let's find out. Welcome. By 1981, the year that most believe that the Pablo Escobar White House photo was taken, the drug kingpin was not as notorious as he would later become. Born in 1949 in Colombia, Pablo Escobar grew up in a suburb near Medellin. After starting as a petty thief stealing cars and reselling stolen tombstones, Escobar became involved in the nascent Colombian cocaine industry. It was a family affair. Escobar's cousin Gustavo Gaviria and brother Roberto were also involved, and Escobar soon consolidated power. In the 1970s, Pablo Escobar helped establish what would become the Medellin cartel. By the mid-1980s, Escobar's cartel would dominate the drug trade and pull in some $420 million a week, according to History Defined. This would eventually give Escobar the eye-watering estimated net worth of over $30 billion. But in the late 1970s, Escobar was not as wealthy and powerful as he'd later become. In addition to growing his cartel, Escobar was focused on his growing family. Escobar married his wife, Maria Victoria Henao, in 1976 and had 2 children with her, Juan Pablo Escobar and Manuela Escobar. And like any well-off family, the Escobars planned a trip together in the 1980s. They would go to the United States and visit famous landmarks. There, Maria would snap a photo of Pablo Escobar at the White House. Would you have done the same thing? Let me know in the comments, and if you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe as it really helps the channel out. By the time Pablo Escobar and his family traveled to the United States, the drug kingpin was on a mission to legitimize himself. As History Defined reports, he was on Medellin's city council, and would go on to win an alternate seat in the country's Congress in 1982. Escobar may have used a diplomatic passport, or possibly even a fake passport, in order to get into the country with his family. That said, the United States didn't view him as a great threat at the time. The war on drugs was unofficially launched in the 1970s under President Richard Nixon, but not expanded until President Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. At the onset of the decade, Escobar and his cartel weren't yet seen as an important enemy. So Escobar, his wife, and 2 children were able to enter the United States without much difficulty in 1981. There, they acted like tourists. Though details of the Escobar family trip are somewhat murky, they appear to have made at least 2 stops, in Washington, D.C. and in Orlando, Florida. In the nation's capital, Maria took a photo of Juan Pablo and Pablo Escobar in front of the White House. Juan Pablo is seen hanging off the railing as his father casts a protective glance down, one hand on his son's arm. The family also made their way to Disney World in Orlando, where Pablo Escobar was photographed looking like any other dad dragged to the theme park. Newsweek reports that Escobar even agreed to face his fear of roller coasters in order to go on certain rides with Juan Pablo. The Escobar family's trip to the United States passed without serious incident. Newsweek reports that Escobar made sure that by hiring a bodyguard, and they returned to Colombia. There, Pablo Escobar's drug cartel would soon grow dramatically more powerful. But it wouldn't last. After his trip to the White House, Pablo Escobar's power and wealth grew. Living by the mantra of plata o plomo, which roughly translates to silver or lead bullets, he and his cartel murdered police, politicians, journalists, and innocent citizens in order to consolidate their hold on the cocaine trade. Escobar eventually controlled about 80% of the world's cocaine trade, which brought him great wealth. He had a sprawling, opulent home called Hacienda Naples, where Escobar kept his infamous pet hippos. And when Escobar went to prison in 1991, he did so on his own terms. Then, Escobar entered a prison in Medellin that he had designed himself called La Catedral. Unlike most prisons, La Catedral had a sauna, a jacuzzi, a billiards room, and a disco. And unlike most prisoners, Escobar was able to continue conducting cartel business from behind bars. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, that Escobar managed to escape from La Catedral in 1992. His flight triggered a massive, nationwide manhunt. Escobar was pursued both by a group called the Search Bloc, a Colombian police unit, and Los Pepis, which was comprised of many of Escobar's enemies. Pablo Escobar was finally cornered 16 months after he escaped from prison. The drug kingpin was killed on December 2, 1933, while fleeing from Colombian authorities along rooftops in the Los Olivos barrio of Medellin. With that, Escobar's life ended. But his legacy has continued to loom large. Not only has his story been dramatized in films and television shows like Netflix's Narcos 2015-2017, but Escobar remains a fascinating figure. It's no wonder that the Pablo Escobar White House photo is a subject of interest to many. In the picture, there's little sign of who Escobar actually was. He looks like a tourist and a dutiful father, keeping one eye on his young son as they stand before an American landmark. In the photo, the truth of Escobar's identity, as cartel leader, murderer, and more, is difficult to discern. Thanks for watching. The Egyptian civilization of the pharaohs lasted for an incredibly long time, more than 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, an ancient Egyptian alive when the last pharaoh died in 30 BC is closer to us in time than he or she would have been to when the Great Pyramids were built. Indeed, the ancient Egyptian civilization is so old that woolly mammoths were still around when the first pharaohs rose to rule the kingdom. One of archaeology's greatest events occurred in 1922, when Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun reigned, circa 1333-1323 BC. The find triggered a wave of Egyptomania that swept the world, and that hasn't receded since. Relics from the ancient ruler, nicknamed King Tut in pop culture, traveled the globe and were viewed by millions in exhibits for which people waited in line for hours. Ancient Egyptian references made their way into popular culture, and musical hits such as Old King Tut topped the charts. Even U.S. President Herbert Hoover caught the Tutankhamun bug, and named his dog King Tut. Today, Tutankhamun is the best-known ancient Egyptian pharaoh, which is ironic. Ancient Egyptians saw him as one of their least memorable and most insignificant pharaohs. King Tut's father, Pharaoh Akhenaten, and his wife's sister, ancient Egyptian royalty often kept it in the family Nefertiti, had been radical religious reformers. Reformers is probably an understatement. They outright overthrew the Egyptian religion that had dominated the Nile Valley for centuries. In place of its many gods, they ordered the worship of a single deity, Aten. Akhenaten and Nefertiti also displaced the Egyptian priesthood, who until then had acted as middlemen between worshippers and the gods. Instead, they made themselves the main conduit through which divine blessings flowed to the people. When the priests objected, the couple closed the main temple at Karnak, seized its treasury, fired the priests, and moved hundreds of miles away to a new city, purpose-built for the worship of Aten. Understandably, the traditional Egyptian priests were livid. As seen below, they undid all of Akhenaten's religious works as soon as he died. Pharaoh Akhenaten died in 1334 BC, after a tumultuous 17-year reign that plunged Egypt into chaos and bankrupted the kingdom. Nefertiti tried to continue her late husband's brother's religious revolution, and stepped up to act as regent for Akhenaten's successor, a 7-year-old born him by another sister. However, she lost a power struggle at court, and power went instead to a chief minister, who became the child pharaoh's key advisor. The kid's birth name had been Tutankhaten birth, which means, living image of Aten, after the god worshipped by his father. Soon as he ascended the throne, the child ruler's advisors had him change his name to Tutankhamen, or, living image of Amen, the traditional Egyptian god ditched by Akhenaten. That heralded a rejection of his father's religious revolution, and a counter-revolution that restored the old Egyptian gods and traditional ways of worship. The new pharaoh was relatively insignificant. He was a child king for most of his life, which lasted for only another 10 years before he died at age 17. In that time, actual power was wielded by his advisors. Tutankhamen was also physically disabled and sickly. A product of generations of royal incest, he suffered many deformities caused by inbreeding. He had a cleft palate, scoliosis, a deformation of the spine, and a clubbed foot, so he needed a cane to walk. He also caught frequent bouts of malaria, which ultimately killed him. When he died, courtiers raided the tombs of his father and Nefertiti, and ransacked them for items to toss into Tutankhamun's tomb. Indeed, the most famous ancient Egyptian artifact, Tutankhamun's mask, had actually been Nefertiti's. Even his sarcophagus had been made for somebody else. Masons simply carved over its original inscriptions and repurposed them for King Tut. One of history's lesser-known facts is the presence of Celtic warriors in ancient Egypt. In the centuries before Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul and its subsequent pacification and Romanization, the Celtic peoples had dominated most of Europe north of the Po and Danube River valleys. They had a fearsome reputation that terrified many. The Romans in particular saw the barbarian Celts, whom they referred to as Gauls, as their greatest national threat. For centuries, Roman mothers quieted down their fussy tots by warning them that the Gauls might hear them. The Romans had good reason for alarm. Throughout much of Rome's early history, Celtic Gaulish tribes dominated Italy north of the Po River and along the much of Italy's Adriatic coast. That was not that far as the crow flies or as the barbarian marches. That was driven home in 387 BC, when Celtic tribesmen, led by a chieftain named Brennus, defeated a Roman army, then marching on to capture and sack Rome. It was a feat no foreigners would repeat for another 8 centuries. The era's Celtic warriors were famous for the quality of their weapons. They were also known for their courage and ferocity in battle, their frightful battle cries, and their terrifying, but naked, headlong charges. That reputation made them highly sought after as mercenaries. From the 4th century BC onwards, and especially after the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's empire into rival Hellenistic states, Celtic mercenaries became all the rage from Sicily to Asia Minor. In addition to fighting for the various Greek kingdoms, Celtic warriors also fought for Carthage. Indeed, they formed a significant part of Hannibal's army when he invaded Italy in the Second Punic War. Celtic mercenaries were also a bulwark of Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty in the 3rd century BC, and were included in the Egyptian army's order of battle. For example, Ptolemy II Philadelphus hired 4,000 Celtic mercenaries, recruited from the Balkans with help from the Anagonids of Macedon. They played a decisive role in beating back a challenge from a half-brother who had tried to seize Ptolemy's throne. However, the Celt mercenaries then made a bid of their own to dethrone Ptolemy and seize Egypt for themselves. They failed, and Ptolemy crushed their rebellion. He then dumped the surviving Celts into a small island in the Nile, to die of starvation. Despite that, the Ptolemies continued to hire Celts mercenaries. Their lack of local roots made them particularly useful in putting down the frequent native Egyptian uprisings. They remained in Ptolemaic service until the end, and the dynasty's final ruler, Cleopatra, was known to have employed Celtic mercenaries. Woolly mammoths were still around when the ancient Egyptian Great Pyramids were built. The hairy beasts, such as Mani from the Ice Age animated movie franchise, flourished during the Pleistocene epoch. The now extinct pachyderms were roughly the size of modern African elephants, and males reached shoulder heights greater than 11 feet, and weighed in at around 6 tons. While no man ever saw a live dinosaur, mankind and its hominid ancestors did share the planet with woolly mammoths for hundreds of thousands of years. Woolly mammoths, in fact, were still around while the ancient Egyptians were busy building the Great Pyramids. Most woolly mammoths were hunted by humans into extinction and disappeared from the continental mainland of Eurasia in North America between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago. The last mainland population, in the Kittik Peninsula in Siberia, vanished about 9,650 years ago. However, small populations survived in offshore islands, such as St. Paul Island in Alaska, where woolly mammoths existed until 5,600 years ago. The last known population survived in Wrangel Island, in the Arctic Ocean, until 4,000 years ago, or roughly 2000 BC. That was well into the era of human civilization and recorded human history. By the time the last woolly mammoth died, the ancient Egyptian civilization had been around for more than 1,000 years. The Great Pyramids of Giza, whose construction concluded around 2560 BC, were already centuries old before woolly mammoths finally went extinct. The civilization of ancient Egypt is so old that woolly mammoths were still around when the Great Pyramids were built. It also lasted for a seriously long time, from before when the Great Pyramids were built, to the annexation of Egypt by the Romans, circa 30 BC. To put into perspective just how long that was, consider this: we are closer in time to one of ancient Egypt's most famous queens, Cleopatra, than she was to the Great Pyramids. Fewer years separate us from Cleopatra, 6930 BC, than separate Cleopatra from the pyramids. Cleopatra famously committed suicide in 30 BC, or 2053 years ago at the time of this writing in 2023. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2580 BC, about 2510 years before Cleopatra was born. So in 2023 Cleopatra is roughly 457 years closer to us than she was to the construction of the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid was not built at the start of the ancient Egyptian civilization, but more than 5 centuries after it began, sometime around 3150 BC. The Great Pyramid's construction required moving and piling up 6.5 million tons of stone, in blocks as heavy as 9 tons. Were they built with slave labor? The Old Testament's portrayal of the Hebrews' forced labor for Pharaoh popularized the notion that slave labor was widespread in ancient Egypt. Ancient Greek writers such as Herodotus and subsequent historians, fiction, as well as film, further cemented the perception that ancient Egyptians used slave labor for their great construction projects. Despite graffiti inside the Great Pyramids suggesting paid laborers, made by the workers who built them, the notion that slaves built the pyramids became entrenched in popular imagination. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves remained widespread for a long time, but we now know that is untrue. In 1977, Egyptologists discovered the city of the Great Pyramids builders, and excavations demonstrated that the builders were not slaves. In 2010, archaeologists unearthed the tombs of the Great Pyramids builders, and their contents debunked the notion that the edifices had been built by slave labor. The tombs held the perfectly preserved skeletons of about a dozen pyramid workers. They showed that their occupants were paid laborers, not slaves. The builders hailed from all over Egypt, and were not only paid for their work, but were so respected for that work that those who died during construction were honored by burial near the tombs of the sacred pharaohs. The proximity to the sacred sites, and the care taken to prepare their bodies for their journeys to the afterlife, disprove the notion that the builders were slaves. Slaves would never have been extended such honors. Pharaoh Thutmose III was a warrior king, and his best-known engagement was the Battle of Megiddo, in 1457 BC. It is the earliest recorded battle in the history of war for which reliable details exist. It took place between an Egyptian army led by Thutmose, and a coalition of rebellious Canaanite states that sought to free themselves of vassalage to Egypt. The rebellion was centered in the city of Megiddo, an important hub at the southern edge of the Jezreel Valley, astride the main trade route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Thutmose departed Egypt at the head of a strong army, and marched to Yaham. He had a choice from 3 routes to reach Megiddo: a southern one via Taunak, a northern route via Yokneam, and a central one via Aruna that would take him straight to his destination. The southern and northern routes were longer, but safer. The central route was quicker but risky, because it required passage through narrow ravines in which an army would have to advance single file. It would be easy for an enemy to let an army file through the narrow passage, then attack the exit and entrance to bottle it up front and rear. Pharaoh Thutmose III figured that the central route to Megiddo through Aruna was so obviously dangerous that no reasonable commander would risk his army in its ravines. He also reasoned that the rebels would leave it unguarded because they would not expect the Egyptian army to court disaster with such an obviously risky advance. Thutmose was the kind of warrior who did not fear calculated risks if the prize was big enough. So he made a gamble, and took the central route. As he had hoped, the path was unguarded, and the Egyptians arrived at Megiddo sooner than expected. Thutmose's sudden arrival caught the Canaanites flat-footed. In the Battle of Megiddo that followed, Thutmose won a decisive victory that secured Egyptian hegemony over the region for centuries. 3,375 years later, in World War I, British General Allenby, an avid student of ancient history, faced the same choice as Thutmose as he advanced northward through Palestine. Allenby led a British army that advanced from the south against Ottomans and Germans entrenched in the Jezreel Valley. He stole a march upon them and burst unexpected in front of Megiddo with an advance through the central route via Aruna. Queen Amenhotep II flourished 16th century BC, was ancient Egypt's most heroic female fighter. A warrior queen of the 17th dynasty, she led armies in combat against the Hyksos, Semitic invaders who had conquered Lower Egypt. Amenhotep took control of Egypt's throne and armies after her husband was killed fighting the invaders, and ruled as regent during the minority of her son, Ahmose I. She kept up the pressure against the Hyksos until her son was old enough to take charge and take over the fight. A stele records Amenhotep's deeds. The king's wife, the noble lady, who knew everything, assembled Egypt. Amenhotep looked after what her sovereign had established. She guarded it. Amenhotep assembled her fugitives. She brought together her deserters. Amenhotep pacified her Upper Egyptians. She subdued her rebels. The queen is the one who has accomplished the rights and taken care of Egypt. She has looked after her soldiers. She has guarded her. Amenhotep has brought back her fugitives and collected together her deserters. The queen has pacified Upper Egypt and expelled her rebels. Queen Amenhotep successfully led her armies against the Hyksos. She fought them to a standstill, and kept them at bay long enough for her son to grow up and take over the struggle. When he came of age, her son, a heroic figure in his own right, took the reins of power, took on the Hyksos, defeated and chased them out of Egypt, and reunified the country. As Pharaoh Ahmose I, he founded the 18th dynasty, during which the Egyptian empire reached its zenith. At its height, Ahmose's realm stretched from Syria in the north to Nubia in the south, and from Mesopotamia in the east to the Libyan deserts in the west. Amenhotep was not done fighting, however. Rebels sympathetic to the Hyksos tried to seize the throne while her son was away fighting the Nubians. So Amenhotep rallied loyal troops, fought them off, and foiled their attempt. For that, she was awarded the Golden Flies of Valor, ancient Egypt's highest military award for courage. It was discovered in her tomb, along with weapons and jewelry, thousands of years later. In ancient Egypt, long before modern medicine or even the concept of medicine as a professional discipline existed, people did not have a firm grasp on why some women got pregnant and others did not. They also had no way to predict pregnancy, or to tell the gender of a fetus in a woman's womb. That did not stop some ancient healers, whether they were charlatans or whether they simply acted on sincerely held but mistaken beliefs, from taking a stab at it. Some of those attempts even worked. One of the earliest written records of a pregnancy is found in an ancient Egyptian papyrus that dates from around 1350 BC. It called for a woman who might be pregnant to urinate on wheat and barley seeds over the course of several days. As the test put it, if the barley grows, it means a male child. If the wheat grows, it means a female child. If both do not grow, she will not bear at all. As seen below, it was not just innocent ancient gibberish. The test actually had some substance to it. When the ancient Egyptian peon wheat and barley pregnancy test was subjected to scientific examination via modern methodology in 1963, it turned out that there might actually have been something to it. To be sure, the test did not accurately predict whether the fetus was male or female. However, it did not do too badly when it came to the detection of whether a woman was pregnant or not. 70% of the time, the urine of pregnant women actually promoted growth in wheat and barley. By contrast, the urine of non-pregnant women and men did not have a positive impact on the plant's growth. It was the earliest known example of testing for pregnancy by detecting something unique in the urine of pregnant women. Scholars identified this test as the first recorded in history to work along the lines of modern pregnancy tests that work by identifying something in the urine of pregnant women that is not present in the urine of those who are not with child. The elevated levels of estrogen in pregnant women's urine might have been the key to the test's success. Another odd ancient Egyptian pregnancy test, although one that was less successful than urinating on wheat and barley, had to do with garlic. Egyptian women who might be pregnant would place a clove of raw garlic next to their cervix when they went to bed at night. When they woke up the next morning, if the sulfuric taste of garlic had migrated to their mouth, they were thought to be pregnant. Unfortunately, it does not seem that any modern scientific tests have supported the effectiveness of the garlic pregnancy test. Egyptian men also had a special use for garlic. The ancient Greek philosopher Charmides wrote that Egyptian husbands chewed garlic cloves on their way home from their mistresses. That way, their wives would not suspect that anybody would have been kissing them with such bad breath. The ancient Egyptians were not alone in their belief in the effectiveness of garlic. Other ancient cultures ascribed various medicinal properties to garlic, from relieving headaches to curing rabies. The Roman naturalist Pliny thought garlic could sap a magnet's power, while Roman legionaries were fed garlic in the belief that it would give them courage. Either that, or repel the enemy with their nasty garlic breath. Pharaoh Ramesses III reigned 1186-1155 BC, is seen by many historians and scholars as the last great ancient Egyptian ruler. A warrior king, he is most famous for having successfully fought against and beat back a confederation of mysterious marauders known as the Sea Peoples, who overran nearly all of the era's Mediterranean kingdoms. The seaborne invaders inflicted widespread devastation that ushered in what came to be known as the Bronze Age collapse, a dark age that lasted for centuries, during which civilization took a nosedive. The one kingdom that the Sea Peoples failed to conquer was Ramesses's Egypt. In the 8th year of his reign, the Sea Peoples invaded Egypt by land and by sea. As he put it, "As for those who reached my frontier, their seed is not, their heart and their soul are finished forever and ever. As for those who came forward together on the seas, the full flame was in front of them at the Nile mouths, while a stockade of lances surrounded them on the shore, prostrated on the beach, slain, and made into heaps from head to tail." Unfortunately, as seen below, although he managed to save Egypt, as was common with many Egyptian pharaohs, Ramesses III had multiple wives and many sons. His designated heir was his son Ramesses IV. However, one of his minor wives, Queen Tiye, wanted her son Pentar to take the throne instead. She enlisted a group of palace officials in a conspiracy to assassinate the pharaoh. In 1155 BC, as the pharaoh relaxed amidst the royal harem in a palace near Luxor, the plotters struck and killed Ramesses III by slashing his throat. Unfortunately for the plotters, although they managed to assassinate the pharaoh, they were unable to accomplish their ultimate goal and install Pentar on the throne. Ramesses IV rallied his supporters and secured the throne. He then rounded up the plotters and had 28 of them executed. Pentar was either strangled to death or buried alive. His mummy was discovered, bearing an agonized expression, which led to its getting designated as the Screaming Mummy. Other plotters had their ears and noses cut off. Queen Tiye's punishment is not recorded. Cats are probably the animals most commonly associated with ancient Egypt. For good reason. There are thousands of cat statues all over the place, and millions of cat mummies. Indeed, mummified cats were so common that archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries recorded that Egyptian farmers routinely crushed and used them as fertilizers. So it stands to reason that ancient Egyptians must have really loved cats and treated them as pampered pets. That was a common assumption, but it turned out to be untrue. Recent discoveries and research indicate that while cats were popular in ancient Egypt, they were not popular for the same reasons as in the modern era. Ancient Egyptians did not see cats like we do today, as pets and cute furball companions. Instead, they saw them as religious sacrifices to be killed in order to please one of their gods. Those millions of mummified cats. They were not dear pets, lovingly preserved by their saddened owners after their sad demise. Instead, they were bred by the millions near temples. Soon as they got big enough, usually around 5 or 6 months old, but sometimes as young as 2 to 4 month old kittens, they were sold to the faithful to sacrifice at the temple. So while ancient Egyptians liked cats, it was a different kind of like than that exhibited by modern cat owners towards their cuddly felines. Feat like these inspired Shelley's Ozymandias. Choice of games. The real ancient Egyptian ruler behind Shelley's poem, "I met a traveler from an antique land, who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone, stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown, and wrinkled lip, and sneer of cold command, tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal, these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay, of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. Ancient Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, circa 1303–1213 BC, or Ramesses the Great, a title he might have bestowed upon himself, was the powerful ruler whom the Greeks named Ozymandias. Often identified as the pharaoh who clashed with Moses in the Exodus story, this Ramesses was the greatest, most powerful, and most celebrated ruler of the New Kingdom, ancient Egypt's most powerful period. A warrior through and through, he battled sea pirates, fought numerous campaigns in the Levant, and led several military expeditions into Nubia. Ramesses II fought the Battle of Kadesh in 1274, the earliest battle in recorded history for which details such as tactics and formations are known. 6,000 chariots took part, which also made it the biggest chariot clash in history. It occurred against a backdrop of a generations-long rivalry between Egypt and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, as they jockeyed to control the lands of Canaan between them. Early in his reign, which lasted from 1279 to 1213 BC, Ramesses II decided to finish off the protracted war once and for all. Over a period of years, he patiently assembled a powerful army and built up supply depots. When all was ready, Ramesses marched north from Egypt into Canaan with 4 divisions. First was the Amen division, led by the pharaoh in person. It was followed by the divisions of Re, Ptah, and Sutek. When he heard the news, the Hittite king Muwaddali II marched south from Anatolia into Canaan, with 3,000 heavy chariots and 8,000 infantry. In the late spring of 1274 BC, Ramesses emerged from the hills above the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, near today's Lebanon-Syria border. Throughout, he had not spotted the Hittites. Ancient Egyptian propaganda boosted a stalemate into a great victory. The Hittites were hidden behind Kadesh when Ramesses II reached the city. However, nomads falsely informed the pharaoh that his enemies were nowhere near. Emboldened, Ramesses hurried with the Amen division to Kadesh, and left the rest of his army behind to catch up. As Ramesses advanced, the Hittites circled around the city, and made sure to keep Kadesh between themselves and the Egyptians as they did so. While Ramesses and the division of Amen made camp, the division of Re straggled up the road behind. That was when 2,000 massed Hittite chariots charged directly across the Egyptian line of march. They wrecked the division of Re, then surrounded Ramesses in his camp. The pharaoh gathered his personal guards, and led a desperate charge that drove some Hittite leaders into the Orontes River. Fortunately for Ramesses, the Hittites behind him abandoned their chariots to loot the Egyptian camp. That was when the division of Sutek arrived in the nick of time, and slaughtered the looters. As the Hittite king Muwaddali sent in the rest of his chariots, the last Egyptian division of Ptah arrived, and the battle lasted until sunset. After prolonged slaughter, the Hittites finally withdrew into Kadesh, and left the field, and technically the victory, to Ramesses. Upon his return, the warrior pharaoh littered Egypt with monuments and murals that detailed the engagement, or at least his version of the engagement. In them, he described himself as Ramesses, the Great, conqueror of the Hittites, which is how we know so much about the battle. Ancient Egyptian poop cures. Most people would agree that dung is disgusting. However, it is widely available, and at some point way back when, some people figured that it might be useful as medicine. Whether for better or for worse, the exact details of how somebody first arrived at that brainstorm are lost in the mists of history. There probably was an interesting tale involved. However it came about, by the time civilization arose, poop was often prescribed to treat a variety of illnesses and assorted maladies. Ancient Egyptians, for example, swore by the healing properties of gazelle, dog, donkey, and fly dung, and the ability of those creatures' droppings to ward off evil spirits. They also used animal poop to heal their wounds. On the one hand, that might have caused tetanus and other infections on occasion, especially when poop was applied to open cuts. On the other hand, the microflora in some animal dung contains antibiotics, so the remedy might actually have worked every now and then. At least enough times to keep alive the belief in the medicinal benefits of poop. The use of fly poop as medicine raises some fascinating questions. Not just about its effectiveness, if it actually was effective. The more fascinating question is just how did people back then, long before microscopes were invented, even manage to spot, let alone gather, tiny fly turds. However they went about the collection of fly poop, Egyptian doctors had a good reputation in the ancient world. As a result, many contemporary cultures looked up and tried to emulate Egyptian medical practices. The ancient Greeks in particular borrowed a lot from the Egyptians. One of those borrowed things was a medical prescription that used crocodile poop as birth control. Ancient Greek women believed that crocodile dung inserted into their vaginas would serve as a powerful contraceptive. It might have even worked. At least in the sense that to encounter a vagina full of or smelling like crocodile poop might have been such a huge turn-off, that it eliminated any desire for sexual intercourse in the first place. Ancient Egypt's last dynasty was a seriously weird family. Few ruling families have been as dysfunctional, perverse, or given to more intrafamilial strife than the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 323 to 30 BC. All 15 of the dynasty's kings were named Ptolemy, numbered I through 15. Of the Ptolemaic queens, there were 7 Cleopatras and 4 Berenices. The family had a tradition of incestuous marriages, mostly with brothers marrying sisters, with the occasional uncle, niece and nephew aunt weddings, and at least one possible mother-son marriage, thrown into the mix. In addition to marrying their close relatives, the Ptolemies were also into murdering each other, and history abounds with Ptolemies killing their brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, and even mothers. The Ptolemaic Empire at the end of the 3rd century, BC. Livius, the dynasty's founder, Ptolemy I Soter, Greek for Ptolemy the Savior, 367–282 BC, was a Macedonian general and close companion of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy was one of the 3 Diadochi, or successors, who carved up Alexander's empire amongst themselves. Ptolemy ended up taking Egypt as his share. There, he set himself up as king, or pharaoh. His descendants and heirs became the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, until Queen Cleopatra VII's suicide and the annexation of Egypt to the Roman Empire in 30 BC. All of the Ptolemaic dynasty's vices, intrigues, betrayals, and perversions, were present in the reign of Cleopatra VII, the Ptolemaic dynasty's most famous ruler. She was also the last of the dynasty who wielded actual power. Carrying on the family's tradition of incest, she married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She carried on the family tradition some more when she fell out with him and plunged the country into a civil war. The conflict ended with the death of her brother husband, after Julius Caesar intervened and took Cleopatra's side in the conflict. She then married another brother, Ptolemy XIV, while carrying on an affair with Caesar. She bore the Roman dictator a son, Caesarion, the future Ptolemy XV, the dynasty's last nominal ruler. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra took up with his chief lieutenant, Mark Antony, with whom she had one of history's most famous love affairs. The couple were eventually defeated by Antony's rival, Gaius Octavius, the future Emperor Augustus. Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra famously committed suicide via snakebite in 30 BC. She was nominally succeeded by Ptolemy XV Caesarion, but Augustus had him killed when he was captured a few weeks later. The deaths of Cleopatra and Caesarion brought the Ptolemaic dynasty to an end. Thanks for watching.
Egypt is well known for their pyramids and the pharaohs, but what do you know about their ancient military in the New Kingdom? Welcome. The ancient armies from circa 16th–11th century BC were sustained by the military-oriented state machinery of the New Kingdom. For example, Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty, reigned 1549–1524 BC, reorganized his band of warriors into a full-fledged standing Egyptian army of the Late Bronze Age. This was a far cry from the Old Kingdom period, 2686–2181 BC, when farmers were seasonally enlisted to fight for their country. By this time, many soldiers were actually drawn from specific warrior castes, which in turn hints at a societal solution for a professional, or at least semi-professional, army. Now of course, beyond just the scope of the manpower, the ruler also had to equip his newly formed pharaoh's army, and that is where the state-run industries entered into the equation. In that regard, The very large number of bronze weapons, like the famed Khopesh swords and arrowheads, could only be supplied by an effectively organized military infrastructure. These industries often consisted of interconnected networks of gathering and distribution centers for raw materials, arsenals for weapons manufacturing, dedicated workshops for producing defensive equipment like shields and chariots, and dockyards for crafting ships and boats. Interestingly enough, the Egyptians even went on to create state-funded stud farms and grazing grounds for horses that were needed for chariots. These highly prized animals were also taken as tributes from vassals based in the Levant and from defeated foreign powers. Simply put, the ancient Egyptian army looked forth to conquer and integrate more territories from ancient Syria and Nubia in a bid to tap into the resources provided by such rich regions, thus fueling a cyclic scope of warfare and economy. Furthermore, there was also a symbolic veneer to the expansion of the New Kingdom army in Egyptian history. In many ways, the rulers and the commanders perceived the proximate nations, like Libya and Nubia, as eternal threats to the tranquility of the fertile Nile River valley of Lower Egypt. In fact, even the earlier Middle Kingdom period, circa 2055 BC 1650 BC, saw Egyptian military campaigns extending into Nubia. As can be comprehended from the dedicated avenues of the standing ancient Egyptian army of the 15th century BC, the empire took its military force and related strategic scope quite seriously. The structure of the military administration mirrored such a proactive outlook, with the main garrison headquarters established in the north and south of Egypt, at Memphis and Thebes respectively. By the time of the great Ramesses II, or Ramses II, there were 4 military headquarters spread across the burgeoning Egyptian empire, each named after the god of the region while being commanded by the chosen senior officers of the army. This Egyptian army, in turn, was divided into 3 major branches: the infantry, the navy, and the elite chariot corps. These massive military complexes were used for training new recruits, creating supply and reinforcements points, providing royal escorts, and even parading troops during triumphal occasions. The high-ranking officers were aided by military scribes controlled by dedicated state-appointed officials who were responsible for maintaining a plethora of records, including the number of new recruits and, more importantly, army rations and supplies. In essence, this type of systematic administrative networking and record-keeping rather reflected the long scribal tradition of ancient Egypt, which rather made the campaign-conducting capacity of the Late Bronze Army more effective than many of the contemporary kingdoms. Our popular historical romanticism about the Khopesh, sickle sword-wielding Egyptian soldier is probably inspired by their real historical counterparts, the Noctua, or strong-arm boys. These close combat shock troops possibly carried a short spear that was thrown at the enemy at close range, much like the Roman pilum, while their melee weapons varied from the bronze Khopesh to even bigger battle axes, some shaped like maces. By the 16th century BC, they also carried larger shields that were beginning to take a rectangular form, corresponding to the 18th dynasty period, which alludes to rudimentary shield wall formations on the battlefield. Such formations were possibly used in conjunction with cover fire from the archers, although there is no evidence of such tactics. Additionally, some of them did wear armor in the form of light leather hide vests. In any case, these infantrymen were grouped into units of around 200 to 250 men, each furnished with their dedicated battle standards. As can be surmised from historical sources, these standards bore prestigious titles that were rather used to maintain the morale and cohesion of many renowned companies, with examples like Splendor of Aden and the Nubian, Bull in Nubia. The semi-professional kingdom soldiers were also accompanied by a host of other light infantry divisions. These conscripts were armed with different kinds of weapons, like spears, small axes, and short swords. One such common Egyptian weapon was the short sword design that had a dagger-like shape with a sharp point. The ancient Egyptian infantry mainly comprised archers and melee fighters. The former were either equipped with regular stave bows, possibly for the conscripts, or better composite bows handled by the regular soldiers. In fact, composite bows were so expensive and in high demand that there were occasions when the Egyptians demanded tributes in the form of the composite bow instead of gold. As for arrows, some of the bronze-tipped specimens, sourced from the plentiful reeds of the Nile, were specifically fletched with 3 feathers to enhance their projectile accuracy. And while many of the archers formed single lines on the battlefield, their shooting tactics differed based on the enemy they were facing. For example, when facing the lightly armored Libyans from the neighboring realms, the Egyptian archers showcased their penchant for unleashing mass volleys that usually caused crippling casualties in the ranks of the foe. However, When the Egyptians tussled with the more heavily armored enemies from the Near East and the Levant, the archers played their supporting role in the encounters. So during certain scenarios, they offered covering fire for the advancing melee infantrymen whom we will talk about in the next entry, thus possibly creating a synchronized maneuver on the battlefield. If you enjoy these videos, please consider subscribing if you are not yet, as it really helps out this channel. Interestingly enough, much like the later-day Roman legionaries, the ordinary soldier of the ancient Egyptian army was possibly motivated by the allure of wealth and social progression. Simply put, while the sons of nobles were expected to be inducted into elite corps like the chariot regiments, even commoners had their chance to progress through the ranks of the military, as can be attested by one Horemheb, a scribe who went to become the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. To that end, bravery was seen as an important benchmark for choosing high-ranking leaders, and as such the selected men who had proven their value in battles were rewarded with the valor of gold. This was a military tradition that entailed ostentatious gifts of gold ornaments and objects being presented to the candidates. Of course, beyond just gold, many of the officers could claim their fair share of land grants, booty, and slaves. Furthermore, by the 14th century BC, the pharaohs created a separate military caste which was basically hereditary in its nature. This provided a steady supply of manpower for a standing army, much like the Kshatriyas of India. These semi-professional soldiers were housed across the various military colonies of the country while being trained and sustained by the aforementioned army headquarters. It should also be noted that while the semi-professional army formed the core of the ancient Egyptian military, these soldiers were also accompanied by conscripted men. Many of the conscripts were forcibly enlisted, with ratios going as high as 1 in 10 men to bolster the ranks. In some ways, the chariots of the late Bronze Age served the purpose of heavily armored platforms that often decided the fate of many a battle fought on open grounds, much like latter-day knights and modern tanks. Unsurprisingly, most factions from the Near East, Mediterranean, and Africa made use of such platforms, ranging from Hittites and Assyrians to Mycenaeans and Egyptians. Interestingly enough, when it came to the latter, the ancient Egyptian horse-drawn chariot fulfilled a somewhat different tactical role than their Near East contemporaries. To that end, Hittite, Mitanni, and other Asian chariots tended to be bulky. Thus their main tactical function related to a ponderous shock charge into the vulnerable formations of the enemy infantrymen, which would have caused a high number of casualties and general chaos among the foe's ranks. As a result, the Egyptians developed their somewhat unique chariot arm, and its primary purpose was to defend their own troops from the aggressive forays and charging of the enemy chariots. Consequently, the design of the ancient Egyptian chariots rather reflected such a defensive tactic. As a result, these platforms, drawn by 2 horses, tended to be lithe and light-weighted than their heavier Near Eastern counterparts. In essence, the Egyptian chariots were designed to react based on their better maneuverability and speed, and thus proved to be more flexible when it came to variant battlefield roles, including even scouting ahead. Furthermore, the sturdy frame that complemented the overall pliable design came in handy when navigating through the rough terrains of Egypt and Canaan. This in turn made them effective in deserts and hilly areas, thus alluding to the increasingly tactical nature of ancient Egyptian warfare. As for the chariot riders of Egyptian history, they mostly comprised the highly trained nobility of the army, including the Egyptian king and his household. These elite warriors, armed with bow and arrow, were often superbly draped in full-body armor, made of meticulously arranged metallic scale armor. Now, given the trend of historical evolution and influence of neighboring military equipment and tactics over time, the Egyptians began to provide better and heavier armor to their chariot troops, which in turn led to the adoption of hefty 6-spoke wheels. However, the overall frame of the ancient Egyptian chariot continued to be nimble, and that allowed their horse-drawn war machines to maneuver effectively inside enemy lines, with zigzag movements and surprise turns. It should also be noted that the Egyptians employed a special class of infantry known as the chariot runners, who had multi-role capabilities on the battlefield. Lightly equipped with bows and javelins, these dynamic troops accompanied the chariots behind their charge to dispatch enemy charioteers and even rescue their own comrades who had crashed. Moreover, they were also expected to receive and absorb the charging momentum of the enemy chariots with their loose formations and potent projectiles. Military history of other ancient empires, Egyptians also had their fair share of mercenaries and auxiliary troops who came from different parts of Africa and Asia. One of the famous allied troops pertained to the Medjai, who were basically Nubian desert scouts of the ancient Egyptian military deployed as an elite paramilitary police force during the New Kingdom period. Similarly, the empire was also known to recruit the remnants of the Shirdan, one of the mysterious sea peoples, as can be surmised from one of the royal guard units of Ramesses II. Beyond such special units, the empire additionally employed auxiliary troops from their vassal states in Syria, Canaan, Nubia, and even Libya. These foreign contingents were bolstered by a motley of warriors with presumably effective martial skills who had been prisoners of war before their re-induction into the army. While not much is known about the dedicated warships of the ancient Egyptians, unlike the later Greeks and Romans, historians have come across credible visual evidence that confirms the importance of the navy in the Egyptian army. For example, the wall details of the Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's mortuary temple, depict how the native Egyptians under the pharaoh were victorious in a naval encounter over the sea peoples. The naval vessels in question here were probably manned by trained marines armed with bows, slings, and even grappling hooks that were used to board the enemy ships and sometimes even topple the ships themselves. And judging by the size and scale of these marine crafts, it can be hypothesized that a standard ancient Egyptian war vessel of the New Kingdom era could possibly carry around 50 crew members, with 20 of them serving as oarsmen and the remaining fulfilling their role as fighters. Thanks for watching. It may seem hard to believe, but one of the most powerful matriarchs in all of history was a prostitute before she rose to power. Qing Shi was born in China in 1775, and after her life as a prostitute, came to power of the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most powerful pirate fleets in all the world at the time. Lady Qing started her early life as many women of the time did. She got married, and the man she married happened to be the brave leader of the Red Flag Fleet. When Lady Qing's husband suddenly passed away, she came to fulfill his position of the leader of the Red Flag Fleet, putting her in charge of over 70,000 fearsome pirates. It is said that after the passing of her husband, Lady Qing gathered the men of the Red Flag Fleet to announce, under the leadership of a man, you have all chosen to flee. We shall see how you prove yourselves under the hand of a woman. She then took control of the fleet, and became the leader they needed. Quiet and thoughtful, Lady Qing was unlike her husband as a leader in every way. Her pensiveness as a leader did not diminish her power in any way. After coming to lead the Red Flag Fleet, Qing Shi remarried, this time taking her late husband's right-hand man as her partner. After marrying, the new husband, known as Chong Pao, was appointed as the captain of the fleet by his wife. It is said that Chong Pao was uneducated and illiterate, unlike Lady Qing, and thus very easy to manipulate on her part, making him the perfect candidate to be put in charge. Although Chong Pao was seen as the leader of the fleet, he was consistently guided by the mind of Lady Qing, who installed many strict policies for every ship in the fleet to follow. The policies were often unforgiving and gruesome, including provisions which state that any attacks made without Lady Qing's approval would result in beheadings, all loot must be distributed by the leaders of the fleet, and if a female captive was raped, her assailant faced decapitation. Qing Shi's powerful leadership made the Red Flag Fleet unrelenting and unstoppable. No other fleet in the world could compete with the men under the power of a woman. The sheer power of the fleet grabbed the attention of the Chinese and Portuguese governments, who then joined forces in an attempt to stop the pirates and dismantle the fleet. The Chinese government released what were known as suicide boats to destroy the pirate ships. These suicide boats were loaded with explosives which were intended to explode near enough to the Red Flag ships so that they would be damaged beyond repair. The plan failed, and with quick work the members of the fleet were able to take control of the damaged suicide ships, and after some repairs, the ships were taken in under the Red Flag. After consistent attempts from the government to destroy the Red Flag Fleet, Lady Qing got tired of her pirate endeavors and retired to avoid more trouble. The government cancelled all warrants for her arrest, and she spent the rest of her life running a brothel and a gambling den, becoming extremely wealthy before her death in 1844 at the age of 69 years old. Eventually, with the help of Chong Pao, the government did eliminate the Red Flag Fleet, leaving Qing Shi's old empire in ruins. Thanks for watching. Earth is completely overrun with humans. There are billions of us living and dying on this planet, leaving signs of our existence in the soil, atmosphere, and even in space. Are we the first, though? Researchers from the University of Rochester and NASA have produced a paper that details how we might be able to tell if humans are the first civilization to arise on Earth. They call the possibility that we're not the first rulers of Earth the Silurian hypothesis, named after the ancient reptilian civilization from Doctor Who. Human history can seem extensive, but we've only existed for a geologic blink of the eye. Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, and complex life has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Modern humans, on the other hand, have only existed for around 300,000 years. That leaves a great deal of time during which other intelligent species could evolve and become extinct on Earth before us. The study comes from University of Rochester astrophysicist Adam Frank and NASA's Goddard Institute director Gavin Schmidt. They address a number of misconceptions about studying the past, and present several ways we might test for a pre-human Earth civilization. One of the first things they discuss is the fossil record. We've all seen the remains of ancient creatures on display, but these specimens represent only a tiny sliver of life on Earth. Organisms only fossilize under very specific conditions. An extinct species could have numbered in the millions, and maybe none of them fossilized. If you're searching for an ancient industrialized civilization, what about ruins? Human urban centers currently only account for about 1% of Earth's surface area. Without constant maintenance, structures tend to be swallowed up by nature in a matter of decades. In a million years, any physical evidence would have long ago vanished. The best we could hope to find are minor, inconclusive anomalies in sedimentary layers. There are, however, several signs of past civilizations that may survive long into the future. We need only look at the activity of humans to learn what they are. For example, humans have burned massive volumes of fossil fuels. We release more than 500 billion tons of carbon from coal, oil, and natural gas, and this alters the ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-13 in plants, soil, and water. Detecting similar spikes in sediment samples from the past could indicate an industrial civilization. Agriculture also causes long-term changes to the planet. Nitrogen-based fertilizers could be detectable for eons in the fossil record. While ancient buildings would not survive millions of years, specific building materials might. Humans have created long-lived synthetic molecules like plastic, so maybe a hypothetical ancient lizard civilization would have as well. If we were to find something similar in the fossil record, that would be substantial evidence for a pre-human civilization. It's an interesting thought experiment, but that's all it is right now. There's no evidence of Silurians or any other intelligent beings on Earth before us, though we can't rule it out completely. If you think of it this way, there was the Ice Age, it melted, a big chunk of Earth actually went lost with the history of it as well, and the Egyptians found the pyramids as there are no record indicating they have built it themselves, so did an ancient civilization exist? It's hard to tell as we still don't have the technology to prove it. Thanks for watching. We all are familiar with the nightmare slasher aka Freddy Krueger, but how much of it is actually true? Or is it just a legend? Well, today we'll find out. Welcome. The film was inspired by several newspaper articles printed in the Los Angeles Times in the 1970s about Hmong refugees, who, after fleeing to the United States because of war and genocide in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, suffered disturbing nightmares and refused to sleep. Some of the men died in their sleep soon after. In the early 1980s, Wes Craven was on the lookout for new ideas. He wanted to make something genuinely terrifying, something relatable that would draw in as many people as possible. After months of searching to no avail, the perfect story suddenly fell into his lap in an old copy of the LA Times, in which he came across a story about a boy who had suffered violent nightmares only to die in his sleep. With that, he began working on the screenplay for 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Following the critical success of his second film, The Hills Have Eyes, Craven was commissioned to make a couple of straight-to-TV movies. After that, the money dried up. With no paycheck for 3 years, he lost his house and was forced to borrow money to pay his taxes. Oh, and he'd developed a strong addiction to marijuana and cocaine, which didn't make the money problem any easier. Everything was falling apart, and then, Craven spotted an opportunity. The boy's death wasn't an isolated incident. Craven had found just one of many articles detailing the sleep-induced death of a Hmong refugee. Having fled genocide in Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam for a new life in America, many Hmong began suffering from extremely violent, potentially PTSD-related nightmares. They were so horrifying, in fact, that many refused to sleep for fear of dying. The authorities lazily dubbed the phenomena Asian death syndrome, which afflicted men between the ages of 19 and 57 and was thought to be some form of sudden death syndrome, or perhaps Brugada syndrome, which affects the heart's rhythm. Today, it is known as unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, though medical research has yet to provide a single adequate explanation for the deaths. Thanks for watching. Throughout history there were a lot of people who changed Halloween month into Halloween years. This is the 5 most psychopathic people in history, but before we get started be sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me what other psychopaths you want to hear about. King of Belgium from 1865 to 1909, Leopold II is best known for ruling over the Congo Free State in Central Africa between 1885 and 1908. Under his brutal rule in Africa, millions of Congolese people died. The death toll estimates vary wildly, and the true number will never be known for sure, but low figures are still around 5 million while high figures sit near 20 million. Leopold's aim was to extract rubber and ivory from the Congo region. To do so, he used forced Congolese labor that toiled under threat of horrific abuse from Leopold's army, the Force Publique. The atrocities committed under his regime involved enslaving the native population, torture, maiming, and slaughter. For example, Leopold II imposed quotas on every man in his realm for the production of raw materials. Men who failed to meet their ivory and gold quota even once would face mutilation, with hands and feet being the most popular sites for amputation. If the man could not be caught, or if he needed both hands to work, Force Publique men would cut the hands off of his wife or children. International pressure over reports of abuse that had leaked out finally forced Leopold to change some of his policies and cede some of his land in 1908. Nevertheless, the Congo was still a Belgian colony and widespread atrocities persisted until the country's independence in 1960, when civil war and atrocities of other varieties began. Born in 1925, Pol Pot became the leader of the Khmer Rouge Party and Prime Minister of Cambodia from 1976 to 1979. He had held the position in a de facto role since mid-1975, but after coming into power officially, he imposed a fierce agrarian policy that led to the demise of about 25% of the Cambodian population. Pol Pot formed a communist peasant farming society, where all of Cambodia's cities were forcibly vacated, and the 2 million residents were forced to live and work in the countryside. Citizens were forced into slave labor. Work began from 4 a.m. and lasted until 10 p.m., overlooked by Khmer Rouge soldiers. Aside from slave labor, the citizens had to endure malnutrition. Workers were permitted 180-gram tin of rice every 2 days, poor medical care, and executions if there were any infractions. Worst of all, the Khmer Rouge committed mass executions and burials in killing fields, carried out using hammers, axe handles, spades or sharpened bamboo sticks. The killings targeted all sorts of perceived threats and undesirables, including intellectuals, urban professionals, supposed foreign sympathizers, opponents of communism, and others. His regime came to an end in 1979 when the Vietnamese army invaded Cambodia and drove out Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. It is estimated that 2 million people died under his regime. Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the Grand Prince of Moscow from 1533 to 1547, and the first Tsar of Russia from 1547 until his death in 1584. His lengthy reign was marked by the expansion of the Russian borders and its progression from being a medieval state to a powerful empire. Ivan had a peaceful reputation at the beginning, not receiving the sobriquet until later. Unfortunately, this early benevolence was actually marked by a number of atrocities due to his quest for expansion and his tendency to control the population via strict military rule. In 1570, for example, Ivan was under the impression that the elite of the city of Novgorod planned to defect to Poland, and led an army to stop them. His army subsequently built walls around the perimeter of the city to prevent escapees and rounded up civilians, torturing and killing between 500 and 1,000 of them in front of Ivan. In what may be an explanation for some of his actions as a bloodthirsty, paranoid ruler, Ivan supposedly suffered from mental illness. Such illness may or may not also explain his decision to beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing immodest clothing, causing a miscarriage. When Ivan's son learned of his wife's miscarriage, he confronted his father, the two fought, and Ivan ended striking his own son in the head with a staff hard enough to kill him. Born in 1900, Heinrich Himmler was the second most powerful Nazi and possibly the most feared man in Nazi Germany. As the leader of the SS from 1929 to 1945, Himmler was responsible for conceiving and implementing the Holocaust. Himmler served as the head of the unified police forces in Germany and also held command of the German concentration camps, organizing and ensuring that the death trains ran on time and that the camps adhered to strict standards of murderous efficiency. His decisions and efforts helped cause the deaths of some 11 million people, including Jews, Poles, Russians, Communists, and other groups deemed fit for death by the Nazis. As for his own personal cruelty amid the enormous wave of murder, it is said that Himmler's house contained furniture and books made from the bones and skins of his Jewish victims. He eventually committed suicide by poison in 1945 as the Nazi regime fell and his comrades were being taken prisoner or executed. Inspiration for the Countess Dracula and a woman deemed one of the most prolific serial killers of all time, Elizabeth Báthory specialized in the grotesque and purely vile. Born in 1560, she served as a countess in the Kingdom of Hungary but has since become known for her sadistic crimes. Though the number of her victims is disputed, it is believed that she was responsible for torturing and killing hundreds of girls between 1585 and 1610. Her execution methods were incredibly disturbing, as she would torture the girls while naked, forcing them to eat their own flesh, stabbing them with needles and burning parts of the face, genitalia and other bits of their flesh. Báthory would torture them for weeks, and many would starve or else be burned or frozen to death. It is also widely believed that she would bathe in their blood under the delusion that it would help her retain her youth. She was eventually caught in 1610, but her affluence and power shielded her from any serious consequences. She was simply forced to while away the remainder of her life in a small set of rooms while guards watched over her until her death in 1614. Thanks for watching.